This podcast is brought to you by Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine for those that love to make and drink great beer. Learn more online or subscribe at beerandbrewing.com or find us on social media at Craft Beer Brew. It's episode 261 of the Craft Beer and Brewing Podcast. For this Tuesday episode, we've got a panel discussion on a pretty interesting and unique subject in the world of beer, hop breeding. We're here in Yakima, and we are sitting at Perrault Farms up in a conference room right next to the baling floor with mountains and mountains of hops being processed and baled right now because we are in the middle of harvest. Joining me for this conversation are the two hop breeders for the Hop Breeding Corporation, Jason Perrault and Michael Ferguson. Welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Jamie.
We're going to talk about all the intricacies of hop breeding. It's been interesting being out here because breeding is a specific subset of hop growing. It's a process of trying to develop new varieties and with improved agronomics and, of course, all the things that brewers love about hops, aroma, flavor, etc. But you're building hops that work both for the brewer's side and for the grower's side and fit those kind of agronomic needs of the industry in terms of yield and disease resistance and all of the kind of mechanics that make the crops work also in addition to all those nice flavors and aromas that brewers want. We're going to talk about how you do that because it's a crazy process and a very involved process and a very there's a lot that goes into it, a huge funnel process to get down to what actually get released as finished new hop varieties. And we're going to talk all through that. But first, AccuBrew is an analytical tool designed to collect and compare the information brewers need to produce consistent results and continuously improve the process of fermentation. AccuBrew is more than a progress bar and early warning system. It's an ever-evolving piece of technology tailored to you and your process. Save time and turn takes faster. Monitor and compare batch progress in real time. Enter notes, set custom reminders and temperature alerts, and detect process issues before a batch is ruined. Quality, consistency, and confidence, that's what AccuBrew delivers. Visit accubrew.io today for a no-obligation 90-day trial. This episode is also brought to you by BSG, who invite you to get funky with Fermentis Safe Brew BR8, the first dry Brettanomyces bruxellensis culture available to brewers. BR8 offers the distinct flavor of Brett Brux, combined with the shelf stability and consistency of dry yeast. BR8 delivers fruity notes early on, but with aging, the base starts to slap as BR8 brings the funk. Visit bsgcraftbrewing.com to learn more. Jason, why don't we start with you? Why don't you give us some background on Hop Breeding Corporation, what it is, what the relationship is, because you all are on different farms, but this is a collaborative effort through HBC to develop new hops for the hop industry. Explain some of that and then explain some of your background, and then we'll talk to you about yours too, Michael.
Okay, yeah, in simplest terms, Hop Breeding Company is a joint venture, 50-50 between John I. Haas and Yakima Chief Ranches. So for all intents and purposes, it is a single breeding program, but we've kept it simple and ran the two companies, I guess backing up a little bit, the two companies had individual breeding programs prior to the formation. And we've been able to maintain the integrity of those programs while combining resources and becoming more efficient, combining germplasm to expand our gene pool. So it's been a very effective combination. And that was formed back in, I think, around 2002 was the official coming together. And so it's been 20 years now since we've been operating together. So it's been a great effort. My role in all this was started back as the breeder for Yakima Chief Ranches. I took over that role from Chuck Zimmerman, very famous name in hop lore and breeding. Very honored to have worked with him. And going further back than that, I'm also a fourth generation hop grower. So my life's been pretty much spent in hops. Started working on the breeding side of things as a tech for Chuck back in high school. And it just kind of evolved from there and stayed involved since.
I know you're also CEO of Perrault farms and run the family farm in addition to this piece too.
Right.
Michael, what's your background?
Yeah, originally from Iowa, so I grew up on a corn, soybean, hog farm there, and that's I think my family's like fourth generation there back in Iowa. So I worked in corn breeding, and then moved to California soon after college, and then started in strawberry breeding for 16 years with Driscoll's in Ventura County, and did that for 16 years. Then I moved up to here 2015. Gene Probasco, he's the one and only breeder I guess Haas had.
Yeah.
And so Gene retired in 2015 after I think 42 or 5 years of hop breeding. So I took over Gene's role for representing the hop breeding efforts of Haas in HBC.
Some big shoes to fill.
For sure.
I mean, Gene was the guy that bred Citra, right? I mean, that's it's quite a legacy right there. Talk to me about some of the hops that have come out of the Hop Breeding Corporation development program over the last few years, or at least the last 10 years.
So you mentioned Citra. That was the first one. So after the formation of Hop Breeding Company in the early 2000s, the decision was made at that time that all varieties released would be released jointly through Hop Breeding Company. And actually, back in that time, Gene and I worked on consolidating a lot of the operations and even the flow through process of varieties that kind of facilitated that joint release then. As you mentioned, though, Gene had been working on Citra for some time. I think he made that cross in 1992. And luckily, he was interested in I mean, the goal of that cross, as I recall, was like more of a noble type.
And in 92, nobody was really, that kind of flavor was not on most people's radar.
Well, he would have made the cross in 92, and it would have went through the vetting process, and that would have taken, say, roughly a decade. So, you're sitting there in the early 2000s. You had this variety that had potential. But that was a much different time in the industry, as you're alluding to. We didn't have to get a variety accepted by one of the major brewers was a very big deal, not easy to do. We didn't have the craft brewing base that we have now that is much more creative, much more experimental, willing to try, and almost required to try new things on a regular basis to stay out in front of things. So it was a bit of a challenge, and so he held on to Citra, knowing that it was something of interest and having a handful of brewers that were interested in. But it wasn't really until things started to take off on the IPA side of things and other similar beers that it really took a foothold. So that was we didn't have that first release ready until 2008, and then after that, the next one was Mosaic, and that was in 2011, 2012, right around that time frame. And I think that's the one variety. If you look across successful varieties in the industry right now, I think that's the one variety that found success after, we always quote this timeline, a decade or so of development. And then you release and you go into this commercial. So in a perfect world, you got 10 years of development, you release it, and, yay, you got a new variety and it's out there and it does great. But in reality, you look at something like Cascade, where the cross was made in 1956, didn't really see any success until the 1970s. And then it had multiple lives throughout the decades of success, and then backing off, success and backing off. Citra, as we already mentioned, cross made in the early 90s, didn't find success until 2008. Simcoe, same thing. Chuck made that cross, similar time frame as the Citra cross. Didn't see success with that until the 2000s. So Mosaic,
you guys are operating like whiskey distillers, where everyone's like, oh, they should just produce more bourbon right now because the demand is so high. But all of the bourbon makers are like, we're not thinking about right now. We're thinking about 10 years from now, because that's the time frame. If we put it in, it's got the demand has to be there 10 years from now. And so predicting what that's going to be, predicting what the beer world is going to look like 10 years from now, that takes a little bit of prognostication on your part.
Yeah, absolutely. And we don't always know what that's going to be. So every variety, as you kind of alluded to earlier, has a value proposition, and it's got to be first and foremost on the agronomics. If it doesn't work there, then it's not going to work at all. but then it's also got to have the value proposition on the brewing side, and whatever that may be. And not every variety in this point in time is going to have a good value proposition for the brewers necessarily, and it might take time for that to develop. So I think that's kind of, like I said, that Mosaic was the one example, I think, and it was because of its time and place. It was released at a time when you had varieties like Simcoe, like Citra, like Amarillo kind of setting that stage, and so it fell into place very easily. But beyond that, I don't see that as being that's less common. Than that's not the norm for sure. Wouldn't you agree?
Yeah, I mean, I think it takes time to get acquainted to a new crop. So I think after 7 years, getting a little handle on things.
seven years now, you're getting up to speed.
Yeah, I mean, on any crop,
Sure.
I mean, you have to spend 2 or 3 years just to get to feel how the actual species grows, even if you're experienced in plants.
Right.
And I think the humbling thing in hops has been mostly is just that I'd say the market development time is as long or longer than the actual breeding process. And I think for me, that's just learning the brewing industry is that, hey, like we've been showing things since I first came on 6 years ago that the brewers were excited, we were excited, but it's a whole thing of like brewers often have their production lineup for the next at least 2 years, and the hops are contracted as much. So when you're putting something new in, brewers have to wait they're waiting as well. Hey, how can I fit this new variety in? And so you can basically, it's like, hey, you have developmental time for the hop breeding, and then the marketing time is as long or longer.
Mm-hmm. Your goal in breeding is to produce new varieties. And then what happens with that? The HBC then licenses that right to grow, or to some of the individual farms.
Right. So the HBC owns the variety as a company, and then licenses the Yakima Chief Group and then John I. Haas to then be the kind of the outlet to the market. And each of those groups have their own growers that they work with. Right. So then they'll go out and license growers to grow it. So it's a pretty great system in that you have two of the, you got very good coverage with regard to brewers, across the globe in terms of the two markets, the markets that they serve. Yeah. So you got great coverage in that regard, but then also, basically nearly 100% of the U.S. hop crop, in terms of the growers is covered by that as well. So great accessibility of varieties to growers across the spectrum, as well as a great accessibility to brewers across the spectrum. So works pretty well.
Sure. Well, let's dig in and talk about what that process looks like, from the, kind of broad, crossing process down into, all the various stages that you work through to get to some final candidates. Before we do that, we all have busy lives these days and can't afford to waste a day stuck on the couch because of a few drinks the night before. Z-Biotics is the answer we've all been looking for. Z-Biotics is the world's first genetically engineered probiotic invented by a PhD scientists to tackle rough mornings after drinking. Give Z-Biotics a try for yourself. Go to zbiotics.com/beerandbrewing to get 15% off your first order when you use beer and brewing at checkout. Z-Biotics is backed with 100% money-back guarantee, so if you're unsatisfied for any reason, they'll refund your money, no questions asked. Also, Arrived mobile point of sale powers places with personality. Arrived is streamlining business operations for the makers of craft with an all-in-one solution that was built with love by hospitality professionals. No contracts and no monthly fees make Arrived a no-brainer for your craft business. Plus, they're offering a special deal to our listeners. Get 25% off all hardware. To redeem, you must launch with Arrived before December 1st, 2022. Go to arrived.com/CBB to request a free customized demo. That's Arrived, ARRYVED.com/CBB. A different kind of POS has arrived. So let's talk about this process. Where do you start? What's the start of of hop breeding. And I shouldn't say there was really a start, because it's just an ongoing, long-standing process. You are just constantly in motion and things are always happening. But what's that kind of first stage of the breeding process?
Well, I think that, in simplest terms, the first stage is deciding what are your objectives and what are you trying to accomplish. And that's going to drive, your selection of parents for crossing. And then once you've made your crosses, that enters into that vetting process. Like I said, it depends on as they say, breeding is equal parts art and science, right? And so you have your process. It's very strict and very driven, but then that process, how you go through that process and the actual which process you use is very much driven by the desire or the art of the breeder. And so everybody has a little bit different way of looking at things. And so, but typically you can say it's going to be a 7 to 10 year process from the time you make that cross. And so the start of it is figuring out, okay, what are we trying to accomplish? What are the goals of the program? And how do we allocate resources based upon that? You could make an argument that even though we say it's a 7 to 10 year process, the breeding program I'm running, for example, has actually been running since the first crosses I made, because you never really stop with your population improvement. Right. You're just constantly moving. Then you over time, you introduce new tools to help hopefully make you better and more efficient. And so I have this program that's been evolving and running since, say 1997, when I made those first sets of crosses in my career. And it continues to evolve. And then over time, you bring more technical expertise, you bring more technology in as it develops to hopefully make that more efficient. And then I have kind of a specific way I go through that. And Michael has a little bit different way of looking at it and the way he runs through, his program. It's all very similar in terms of the vetting.
How do you start and make crosses? I mean, what's that process of doing that look like?
Yeah. I mean, a nice thing, for me coming into an established program that's been running for decades is, there's a lot of data that already exists on selections that have been there for 20 years or more, so the first part you're going to start at is looking at, you've walked through the field at least one season or two seasons, like, hey, these plants look of interest. Then you look at their data either from, there's basically, I look at.
They look of interest. What does that mean?
Well, the plants themselves in the field look good. Yeah. So the plants they're
producing a lot of cones. They look robust.
Yeah. So basically, for me, I boil it down. You want a plant that just races to the top of the wire, stops, and then it grows lateral branches. So it's basically you want as many nodes up to the top of the wire, hit the top of the trellis, and you kind of want it to stop around the solstice. And then it's just like you want horizontal lateral branches, and that's just all bud points. That's all going to be yield. So that's like the key thing you look at from a general plant that's the basic foundation of everything. And then behind that is cone, so cone density, cone weight. So the more dense that cone is, it's when you're going to get more mass per acre. I call the goodies. That's where all the oils, all the flavor compounds. So the heavier that cone is just you get more weight, more flavor potential, more alpha acids.
Sure. So
those are the kind of, from a plant perspective, those are things you look at. I kind of forget where I was going with my direction there. So you have data on those. I mean, basically you're going to have some chemistry data, basic chemistry, aroma. You're going to judge those. And if they've been in the program a while, there'll be some sensory data, like those hops have actually been brewed with, and you're going to have some basic sensory. So, I mean, I look at it, it's
and Haas has an experimental brewery where you do make some brews with some of these hops that are in the process.
Yeah, that's I think the biggest part of our program is on both sides of the JV. There's a lot of brewing resources. I mean, this operation at the end of the day is a brewer-driven operation. We don't plant out a single acre if there's not a brewer driving it, other than alpha acid. That's something that we drive, but it's more clear cut. But from an aroma flavor standpoint, nothing gets planted without a brewer behind it. And that's based on YCR's got a brewing program, Haas has a brewing program, sensory teams it's based on beer. I think that's the thing I'm most proud about is like if you come into either one of our companies showing you something, you can rub those hops, but you're also going to be tasting a single hop beer made with those varieties.
So you look for robust plants that have good agronomics, and then you check up on the chemistry behind them, look at some of the sensory data. Like how many plants, for one of these might be in the ground at any given time?
It's usually for brewing is 7 hills. I mean, that's like probably this basic first starting step for brewing.
What do you mean by 7 hills?
Well, 7 plants of a given selection. And then at that stage for brewing, there might be, how many different genotypes you think at that stage? Probably, I guess it depends, but every year we're advancing anywhere from 20 to 50 into an advanced stage that will expand it to, say, like 7 hills. And so then that, of each individual. So we go from one plant to 7 plants. And then from that 7 plants, then we have enough material to do, sensory and chemistry and brewing. And that then, creates the data foundation that we select from to say, okay, yeah, this is going to move forward. And to, Michael's point when he was talking earlier that, I would say in my experience, we select these plants. We think we've got some great aromatics. We got all this great data, but when you brew with it, I would say about 95% of the time everything falls apart.
Yeah.
It's underwhelming.
Right, right.
That what you were smelling in the hop doesn't necessarily translate into the beer. And so then, we don't have any interest in underwhelming.
It's all that question about survivables, right? What actually can make it through that, through that whole brewing process.
That's the part for me coming into this as a fruit breeder. That was like, I'm a home brewer. I've been homebrewing for 20 plus years. And that's why I came to this job, because it was just an opportunity to combine, 2 things, breeding and brewing. But man, every hop I had ever brewed with had already been vetted. So like my naivety coming here is like, oh, I'm going to smell these hops, make amazing beers. I'm like, oh, that first year was like, kind of like almost like a cold sweat came upon me. Like, this is going to be way harder. Because in fruit breeding, man, like you're just on a flavor, you can just pull it off. And if it was a hop cone, you could just it was a mini beer you could drink.
Right.
And your job there is done.
That's true. That fruit gives you all you need right from when you taste
from
it, right
flavor.
At that point. Yeah. And that hop, you don't want to chew that hop.
No.
So when the flavor, you would have to spend any hop you're going to brew. That's 2 weeks of. There's some kind of work, as you well know, on the brewing side. Like it's 2 weeks, about the minimum you can crank out even a rough beer, right?
Sure.
So that's pretty. From terms of breeding, especially for a large company like this, it's all about sample size. There's a lot of dictates a lot. So right there. If every hop's going to take 2 weeks to evaluate, that's going to be your bottleneck from a flavor perspective.
Sure. Let me back up a little bit further. So when you make a cross, you're putting 2 parent plants together, obviously a male and a female, and the goal is to create seeds. And as we all know, like those seeds that you make are also pretty, can be vastly genetically different. Not every kid's the same, right? And so then you end up, with this cross and a whole bunch of these seeds. And then, what do you do from that seed point at that point?
Well, at that point, we'll collect the seed, and you're selecting your parents based upon, like I said, your objectives. And then parent selection isn't just a shot in the dark. We'll certainly take luck any day of the week, but, it's really driven by the knowledge you have on the genetic background of those plants and the combining ability of those plants and what contribution they can make. From there, as you've alluded to, you have your seeds, and each one is genetically distinct. So they're all brothers and sisters, hops being dioecious. So we plant those out into a high density planting that allows us to vet a lot of plants in 1 year and try to get
just little pots or something like that.
Well, they're started out in little pots, either little plugs or 4-inch pots, and then we plant them out in that nursery and allow them to grow, and they'll actually flower that first year, so we can get a kind of a first evaluation. And it's a
How many seeds will parents generally create?
It really depends. We'll depending on the cross. So you could cross against a whole plant, and you could end up with tens of thousands of seeds, literally, or you can cross a single sidearm and end up with 100 seeds, or less. And so it just depends on
so if you see a particular branch of the hop, that's where you might
well, yeah, it just kind of depends on what you're doing. Like when
I have seen these as we're driving around with little bags just kind of around a portion of the plant,
right.
Where you guys are working on.
Yep. Yeah, the traditional view of it, like when I was first getting started, was the bread bag. You just take a bread bag and cover a sidearm, and that's what you would cross. We've kind of moved on to larger bags.
Yeah.
It looks like a giant candy wrapper basically across a big section of the string that covers a lot more, and then we'll blow the pollen into that. And that's that by bagging it like that, you're just isolating those flowers, basically keeping outside pollen that might come in from being introduced, and kind of mixing up the cross a little bit.
Because you don't want everything to start making seeds, and,
right, yeah,
and putting down potentially male plants in your fields, which would be a
that, and you just want to be able to, if you're making that controlled cross between two parents, you want to make sure that's the only pollen that's in there, so that you get accurate assessment of that cross. Because it's really we are looking for results in terms of a new variety out of each cross. That's the goal, but perhaps just as importantly, maybe not from an economic standpoint, but certainly from a driving of efforts for us, the results you get from that cross in terms of what you learn from the two parents and crossing those two parents, and by evaluating the progeny, what you learn from that really drives your efforts going forward. And it's super important in terms of the efficiency of the overall program and your ability to take advantage of the variation that's out there. So that's super important. So you want to make sure you're keeping that as cut off from other pollen as much as possible. So that's the idea behind the bagging. Otherwise, we could just go out there and start blowing pollen around.
Right. So then they produce seeds. You gather those seeds. Then you plant these seeds. What's that next process of evaluation look like?
Well, that's where we look at
end up with now a whole bunch of small plants.
Right. So we grow, like I said, we grow those out on that high density nursery. And that's where we, that kind of first look of evaluation. And there's different approaches to that. And that's where a lot of the power of our program comes in, where we have the two different kind of approaches to it. And, whereas I focus in more on a negative selection and culling out that first stage, Michael does a little more positive selection at that stage. So it's two different approaches, and both work really well. And so it just kind of depends on what you're trying to accomplish.
What does that mean, Michael?
Really just on that first year when you have your hybrid seedlings is looking for positive attributes, whether it be aroma or alpha acid or just the plant. It's trying to move those in a little faster, just so you can get a better look for you can save a few years while you're also still having it's just kind of a good hedge. We have our single hill, and that's a more realistic view on a high trellis, and you can view the plant. And this other subset just kind of gets things, the positive selection allows you to move things in a little faster from a population standpoint, so you can get a little quicker view on them. And it's just more, I think it's based up more on a population. There's certain things that you're just trying to move through a little quicker, so you can hey, I want to see the potential of this a little sooner, so I can cross onto it for bet. And
sure. How's that vary from what's negative selection by contrast?
Well, negative selection, you'd be looking at just the negative. So instead of looking for those positive attributes, like, this plant yields really well, or it looks like it's going to yield really well, or it's got, great aromatic, you'd be looking for, this one's got powdery mildew, or this one has got I don't like the cone type, or, or you might say we know it's not going to yield well because it doesn't even have the vigor to reach the wire, or something along those lines.
Mm-hmm.
Very simple look at it to say, okay, we know this isn't going to perform, so let's get rid of it.
Yeah.
So it's a concept that we just call it fail fast. We know
Sure.
we know 99.9% of them are going to fail. So why not make them fail fast?
Do you specifically subject them to stressors? Do you look at do genetic sequencing to understand if they have genes that do certain things? Like what qualifies something to fail?
Well, in terms of introducing stressors, we've we have in the past, we introduced disease screening, say like in the greenhouse, or my personal feeling is that Mother Nature does a good enough job. If you put them out in the plot, Mother Nature is going to do a good enough job of subjecting the proper stressors, and we can move them forward. If you, I've found that if you artificially introduce those stressors, oftentimes it's too much, and you're actually getting rid of things that maybe you shouldn't. And then you key in on a good point, in terms of the underlying genetics that are driving that, and looking at ways to take a little bit more of an unbiased look at that just through the molecular analysis. And that increasingly, yes, we are relying on that more and more as we as we gain an understanding to help us in that selection process. But at the end of the day, most of the selection is still driven by the breeder's efforts, and whether it be positive or negative selection, whatever you want to call it.
So then you either through positive or negative selection go from these tiny seedlings into something that you want to go plant into the ground. How many seedlings would you have, and then how many then get it? You mentioned maybe 20 to 50 ultimately then get planted from that.
Oh, actually, no. From that, we'll go. Like I said, like Michael was saying, there's kind of a couple different approaches. So if we're going, we got the two parallel routes. So if we go straight from the seedlings to single hill, then you're looking at, we might start with anywhere from 25 to 50,000 seeds at the start.
Yeah.
And that's different genotypes. And then we get those planted out. And let's say there's 25,000 that get planted out at the seedling nursery after germination and everything else. We might carry, 3,000 to 4,000 of those on to the single hill. And then the other parallel to that is the fast track program, where that Michael was talking about. That what's your
maybe
typical
1%?
Yeah, 1% of those would move on to that program.
150, 200 maybe.
Yeah, and I think we're and from the single hill stage, then it enters into that kind of that from that point about a 9-year pipeline. We're 3 years at single hill. And then after that single out of those 3,000 to 4,000, that's where we might select another 20 to 50 on top of the fast track to go on to a yield trial stage or a 7-hill stage, what we call advanced lines.
I'm just trying to think about the mechanics of keeping track of 3,000 or 4,000 single plants out in a field, and then kind of measuring and walking through that. I mean, are they kind of grouped or tracked, or does that also then become a kind of fast fail program where you can very quickly see if something's just not growing? Now, of course, you're also talking about year-to-year variations in climate and growing conditions, and also all sorts of other things that can potentially impact that too. But how do you manage through that kind of massive data collection process?
Well, I think the key is to kind of simplify it, right?
Yeah.
Because I think you can make a decision in a split second on whether or not a plant is attractive or not.
Yeah.
Visually, we're faster than probably any computer in just terms of just walking and looking at a plant and just saying, okay, yeah, this one's interesting or this one's not. And so that's going to be your first. So even if we have 4,000 plants planted out, of those 4,000, you might only harvest and sample 200.
Yeah.
And so it's not as vast the numbers as, the numbers are big, and that's key, because breeding is a numbers game. No matter what approach you use, breeding is a numbers game, and everything follows, a bell curve, particularly on the complex traits. So you're always looking for the tail ends of that bell curve, whether on either end. And so
why are the tail ends of those bell curves interesting?
Let's use alpha, for example, or just yield. Let's just use yield. That's the simplest. So, most of your population, you're going to have your really low yielding ones. There's a few that fall into that. And then as you go here, there's kind of this middle ground here where most of your selections will fall. And let's just say that's your minimally commercially acceptable yield, and so you're not really selecting there.
Right.
What you're most interested in is this bucket over here. That's
one
or two standard deviations above the mean, to where that's where you're going to be selecting if you're looking for high yield. And so it becomes, if you're looking for yield specifically, if you're walking that plot, it becomes pretty easy to just say yes, or no, then boom,
right.
Yes, yeah, that one's definitely. After you do this for over time, it becomes pretty quick to pick out the high yielders. So that's really, what you try to simplify it in that regard. You got your first kind of blush vetting that you do that says, okay, we know that 99% of this is no good. So let's only focus in on the stuff that we
no matter
know.
how good it might smell, or it's just not.
If it
doesn't yield, it's not going to be useful as a crop.
I see what you'd say about that, but it becomes really tempting. You start smelling enough of them, and I've had to resist that temptation in the past to move stuff along that you're like, wow, this is really good. But
yeah.
I was thinking, kind of taking a step back too, is that everything we do when it's a huge program and you're trying to satisfy two of the largest hop companies. So, I mean, it's a big program. We're running combined 200 crosses a year. You're running 20,000 seedlings. It requires a good labor crew. There's people that have to go collect pollen from these males. It's a combined, we have a pretty good size, probably 10 dedicated people in addition to us that are going out there who have to care. I always like kind of boiled it down to the people that are working this thing have to care because it's so detail oriented. Like you have to correct the pollen from this male because there's a plan behind it.
Yeah.
Because otherwise we're flying, we have these big lofty plans, but there's a lot of little steps that have to be executed. Like, you put the pollen on that female, then you collected that one seed, put it in the right cell, and then that goes, there's a whole handoff. There's a handoff. So you have all these lofty plans, whether it's, I always say molecular. Molecular is always the thing everybody likes to talk about because it's like the cutting edge of science. Like it's all based on traditional process and data that made the model. Mm-hmm. So it's just that classic garbage in, garbage out. So I think for us it's just like you have to care, you have to have good processes, and you got to be out there in the field.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's a highly disciplined process, and the crew that executes on it, which goes well beyond Michael and I, they're the discipline in that. They're the ones that run that process, and it's
how big are each of the teams that pull this off?
On our side, it's probably 5 to 6 people.
We're about the same.
Yeah.
So there's about 5-6 core people, that are working on breeding per company year round, and then of course you have your seasonal stuff. But then you got your support teams from the farms that help manage the plots and make sure that gets done right. So it's a pretty large and concerted effort at the end of the day when you start pulling all that in.
Sure. So you go from, you've got all 3,000 or 4,000 single hills, and from there you weed that down to the next step, the advancement or the advanced program, where they move up to about 7 hills. What happens at that stage?
That stage, that's where we've got, again, the 2 parallel programs. So the stuff that we moved into fast track actually will cut out the single hills. So they're reaching that 7 hill stage early. And then the 7 hill stage of stuff that came out of the single hill, that's where we can really start focusing in on the more of a robust sensory analysis, the more robust chemistry, and then of course the brewing with the hops, and to see how they're going to perform in that regard.
Yield at that when you get to 7 hill, it's just a nice size to get good yield data, see the plants. You get 10 to maybe 20 pounds of hops to brew with, and we can, some of our most focused customers that we send samples out of there for them to trial in their pilot breweries. And so I think to me the 7 hills where that really get serious.
Yeah. And at any given time, you're running a couple hundred of these 7 hill plots.
I think that's a fair number. I mean, it varies, but yeah, I mean, we've got, from the traditional process, you're going to have at least 3 years worth of those there in that stage. And then, on top of that, we've got fast track, and I don't know how many years you tend to try to look at those there, but
probably 3 and 10, at least 3 for anything for me.
Yeah, and then we say 3 years, but really 3 years is difficult to get all the assessment done. For something as subjective as aroma and flavor, it's tough to say after 3 years that you've done everything you can to make sure that they're either going to succeed or fail. So I think there's a contingent that stick around for quite a bit longer than that, just because we want to make sure we give them the opportunity to truly succeed or ultimately fail.
And sometimes you guys develop some favorites in there that you're not quite sure, you're not quite ready to let them go.
Yeah, I'd say that's fair.
I was thinking, I mean, there's kind of three components that to me have been the most challenging moving into hops. One is the flavor aspect I talked about. Males, that the male component's huge. And then talking about this 3 years, the time it takes to evaluate something confidently is because you always, that first year is always a baby year. So hops at your best when you first transplant, like, hey, you see it in a single hill and you move it to a 7 hill. Well, you have that immature year, that juvenile year, which is, you can evaluate it, but you can't be confident on it. So that always slows you down because you're always doing this scaled up process. Like, hey, I have 1 7 hill. I like it. Now I want to see it on a bigger scale. And so that next year, that next larger scale is going to be a baby. So then you, in a sense, you're always a step behind because of how hops develop that way. So that's, and breeding is all about time. Like you're always, if you're in a competitive environment, you have to move fast if you're in a highly competitive environment. And so those things, there's only so many gears and levers you have. Like the plant's just like going to like put there's just things you cannot change. And that is one you cannot change in hops.
Right. So you then brew with some of these, at the 7 hill stage, or send some of those, 10 or 20 pound samples out to some brewers, who you trust, or, how does that decision-making process go? And, how organized is that? It sounds like there's more of a, is there a pure direction? You have a very organized, we're going to brew with all of these and test all of them, or, or how do you make some decisions about what and who gets to brew with which?
Well, internally, it's definitely easier because we're just looking at the internal brews that we do. When I use the Haas brewery, it's stuff that I'm interested from a purely breeding perspective, really. Mm-hmm. It'll be probably 2/3 will be just stuff I'm looking at from a pedigree and historical perspective. A third might be like, hey, these meet all the marks on yield. And so the agronomics and the brewing components are there. And so those are pretty easy to put through if I luckily have those resources to draw upon. And we just do it pretty simple. We've refined it over the years, but we've pretty much boiled it down to it's just a base bittered beer, just pale malt. We'll bitter it with like a neutral extract to get like 30 BUs. Mm-hmm. And then we just pull that off and we can run around. Basically, you dry hop during active at late primary. And so then you can give pretty high throughput look at it and screen it on an IPA basis, where you like 2 pounds a barrel late primary. And so you can run those through.
So IPA becomes the baseline that everything gets evaluated on now.
And for me, that's because if you don't get flavor out of a hop in an IPA dry hop basis, it's just not there. And that's fine. If we don't see it, to me, those are the ones like, hey, you're going to look more at like a subtle style, like lagers, hops that might just be workhorse pale ale hops. And if they have, at that point, if they don't have that big punch on, like if you're doing a 2 pound per barrel rate and you're not getting something that punches you in the mouth, like, hey, then it's going to have to be you're going to be relying on agronomics like high yield, because it's not going to be an exciting, sexy flavor space. So the value is going to be it's going to have good yield.
Yeah, the IPA base just gives you kind of that idea of contribution, right? If something, we're not, we don't want to be just focused on IPA style hops. Sure. Obviously there's a focus on the more traditional continental, aromatic, but that IPA gives you kind of that first blush, relatively easy process to evaluate by,
right,
versus going out and, kicking out tons of lagers with these things, trying to figure out what the contribution is. So,
and you can brew a bigger base brew and then just dry hop a bunch of these in separate kinds of ways and have a consistent baseline across all of those that you can just measure and evaluate against.
Yeah, and I can't I won't speak for Michael, but I think for the most part, you can smell a hop out in the field that you can go, yeah, I think this would fit really well in that lager style or that, that noble category. There's just kind of an aromatic you get that you can smell right away out in the field. And so we can classify them and then maybe even run a separate set of trials as well. So it's not all just, so
and you all are developing, American noble, style hops. I know there's, we've written about some of those, also ourselves. And so, right, it's not solely IPA focused. And I think that goes back and speaks to what you talk about at the very front end, that you set your goals for the program. And, if the goal is a new IPA hop, which probably makes sense, that's a big goal. That's high in demand for brewers, but also American noble style hops can, be another goal that you all are following. Are there any other goals that you tend to outline from that first step?
Well, I think, we tend to, you just look at the opportunities that are out there. Obviously, both programs were originally developed around alpha.
Yeah.
Building efficiency into the alpha supply chain. And a lot of the success we've had has kind of fallen out of that effort and actually then shifted kind of our focus over towards aroma. But certainly alpha is still a component of that.
Right.
And if you're looking across the industry in terms of acreage, still a large volume of acreage of Cascade and Centennial. And, there's a large demand for these noble types. So, yeah, there's these definite opportunities in that regard that will never go away. So we're certainly always looking at those. And then, in terms of flavor and aroma in the IPA space, I think from my standpoint, adding, value in terms of new flavors and aromas, things that maybe we haven't seen before is certainly exciting. Will those hops ever come in and be the next big Citra or Mosaic or Simcoe and displace all those acres? No. To me, it doesn't need to happen though for a variety to be successful. I think if you can just provide a value through new flavors and aromatics to allow brewers to further expand their products, I think that's important as well.
Sure. So you've got a few hundred of these 7 Hill plots now. What's the next step in the development process after that? You here and there, you all are brewing with them. Sometimes an outside brewer friend might brew with a little bit of that. Where does it go from there? How's the next selection get made?
Well, their first step would be replication. So you expand it, just looking at a more replication to get a better view on its agronomics. And you always want to keep brewing consistency. That's always a component too. And it's on both farms, so things go both on Haas and Yakima Chief ranches that we're covering the geographic areas, so we're not getting a blind spot there as we get more serious on something.
What does that mean?
Basically, that we have.
You guys aren't that far apart here.
Yeah, yeah.
It's not like, or are you growing some up in Moxie also?
Yeah, I mean that's always the thing to be mindful. Like I always see it in our test plots. There's just certain sections of the fields I know there's a ton of rocks, and so you always have to give some leeway on the good and bad, because there's just the soil it could be in and that's just kind of number one thing in plant science is you always have to do a lot of reps across different soils.
Yeah, I think the key here is that we have access to the resources. So if we get serious about something and we want to see how it performs in different areas, we've each got a network of however many growers we can work with to get small plots planted. And so at that point, we might start, even planting into other regions like Oregon or others, and so we can at least begin that assessment process to see whether this new variety has good general adaptability to the entire region, or is it very specific to just here? Obviously, you prefer general adaptability across the entire region, so that's where we'll work within our grower networks to begin that process of expanding that out and seeing how well it does once it's proven itself to a certain point.
So how many plants then go from that 7 Hill stage up to this next test plots in multiple spots?
No, it's very few. I mean, most years, none.
None.
Yeah, I'd say every like this last year we expanded a few, but even those, I don't know that we'll go into like a full 1 acre trial into different locations. They might just go into an expanded yield trial. But It's actually fairly rare for things to make it into that stage. Let's say on average, maybe if you average it across years, maybe 1 to 2 a year.
Yeah. So it's highly
selective. Does that seem about right?
Yeah, I'd say 1 or 2 come out each year that you're interested at. And then if you're talking about truly special things, once every 5 to 7 years.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, boy, if you look at our pure seedling numbers, I mean, that's maybe 1 out of 80,000.
Yeah. It's incredibly low success rate.
Yeah, no, that funnel really gets narrow there at the end, and so then you come up with this process. You start with that one every other year or so. You start plotting out more growth and testing this in different kinds of regions. That's still not a guarantee that hop will ever make it to market, get a name, and become something that is then sold routinely to brewers.
Right.
I mean, for me, the most frustrating thing right now is it's very easy to get a really impressive IPA hop to get traction on it. I mean, we do set like baseline minimum yield thresholds. We want to raise the bar where it used to be for, like, we're not going to show something to brewers anymore unless it meets a responsible yield level, both responsible for the farm, the environment, the whole just supply chain. But the thing that I think for me, just in my short time here, and Jason, probably more for you, is that we have these hops that are, they're not wow, but they're very nice hops, and they yield incredibly better. So like twice, say, Cascade, in the realm of Cascade flavor, but the yield is twice. But they're much harder to sell. You're gonna come for each of our companies, you're gonna taste this IPA hop that will blow your head off. I'm like, hey, here's this Cascade hop. And just getting that focus, I think that for the whole industry, we want to do it as breeders and farmers. I think it's getting brewers engaged, like, hey, start looking at the hops you're growing, and both from a supply chain risk and a cost, like in a sustainability, environmental, there's needs to be a look at that, because it's not a small, like, Centennial, what that impact is on that is not small. And it's just tough for us. Brewers we can't do it alone. We have to have brewers who want to go down that road with us.
Mm-hmm.
If I'm hearing you right, what you're saying is that there are some of these varieties that brewers may lean on that you all are also trying to develop better, more agronomically suitable versions of that can kind of fill that same role, but do it in a way that's better for the farmers, better for the environment, maybe uses less irrigation or less pesticides, reduces the carbon footprint as a result of doing that.
Noble hops are
a great example.
Yeah.
Yeah, if you look at those categories that I outlined earlier, Cascade's kind of its own category, right? Cascade Centennial's kind of its own category, and then you have the noble hops. Those are great targets for us as breeders, and something that we, for years have keyed on. In fact, when I first started in my career, I had a couple different of my mentor old school breeders, as I was focusing in on aromatics, tell me, why are you focused on aromatics? It's aromas, it's too challenging, it's dead. You'll never find success in that, because those are so entrenched, and it's so difficult to get brewers to switch over from those. That it's a real challenge, but a huge opportunity from a just look at it from a sustainability standpoint. If we could get a switch over to some of these higher yielding complements or alternatives to those varieties, that could be big.
I think you're right, and it's actually strangely something that we were talking about with Stan Hieronymus last week, because I know he's been beating the drum on sustainability, especially as new data comes out just about how impactful specific varieties, like certain hops are far less sustainable or have a much larger carbon footprint, whether, again, it's due to pesticide necessity or, some other, or fertilization. Fertilizer also, consumes, increases the carbon footprint. So if you can reduce some of those necessary inputs, then you can certainly improve the overall environmental prospect for a certain hop. And it's something that brewers may not have paid as much attention to before, but some of the more environmentally focused breweries have started to look at that and in a more significant way, and understand that there really is, some footprint there that they can reduce by focusing on hop variety, which again, it's not something that people had really considered much about in the past.
Right.
So you send some of you start making some plots. What's the next step after that? If for something that starts to hit, and I mean, you've maybe got a few of these then going at any given time. Of those tests, how many might be going? Because those will be multi-year tests, I assume. Also, then.
At the elite stage. Yeah, that's what we call the elite stage.
The elite stage. Yeah. Okay.
And it varies. I mean, maybe you say half a dozen to a dozen, depending on the year. That might be running at any given time. And really, at that stage, it's just about confirming that performance, both at the grower level and the brewer level, and then kind of whittling it down to that decision of, is this commercially viable? Is this something that will have legs and take off? And generally speaking, that takes all the input, the entire input from all the years of evaluation, but then also takes a lot of times a good champion in the brewing industry to help carry that over the finish line.
What do you mean champion? What are you looking for that?
A partner brewer that says, we'll take a risk on this. We'll partner with you on getting some beers made and then really confirm that performance for you.
What do they have to do to champion that? Do you mean are they guaranteeing a certain amount to purchase, or what does that look like?
Yeah, absolutely. We'll work with them. We'll call it sponsorships or call it whatever you will.
Right.
We'll partner up on a plot, and oftentimes that's kind of the determining factor on whether or not something performs to expectations or not. And it's usually pretty good feedback once you get it back from the brewers that say, this just didn't do anything for us, or this is really awesome. This is performing great. So that can be pretty powerful.
These
feedback.
are the elite stage or the numbered hops that we see now, and the brewers are brewing with, right?
Right.
So like what we were cutting down, where we picked here on Friday with the Single Hill folks, or grabbed out here for the kiln 586 is one of those in the elite stage, or 1019 that we got from Michael over at Haas on Friday. Those would be elite stage hops then.
Right.
What takes something from there over the final finish line of getting a name and being becoming part of the official lineup and expanded sales program through all the companies? I mean, it almost gets taken off your plate at that point, and becomes a broader business decision for lots of folks involved, huh?
Yeah, in a lot of ways, from a purely breeder standpoint, hopefully we've done our job, and it's been vetted and successful in all ways that we've measured. And then it kind of falls into a sales and marketing realm at that point.
I think the naming point, we still do it primarily because it still signals to the brewing industry that we're serious. This has legs. It's something you can plan beers around for the long term. Versus, there's still some skittishness on brewers. If it's a number, is it going to be around for 5 years? Or is it just? But I mean that's really, if we're keeping it. If we have brewer interest, it's working on the farm. It's going to continue. Like 586 has just continued to grow since we first showed it 6 years ago. And there's others. I mean, there's other variety numbers in the 630s, another one that's continued to grow.
630, 638, 472. These are all varieties that still exist. All the numbers still have a following, and they're just kind of, finding their place. And then every once in a while, one will rise to the top and really start to shine. 586 is a good example of that. So,
how many acres of 586 are being grown right around now? I mean, do you know off the top of your head?
Oh, off the top of my head, I think it must be about 150 or something
somewhere
like that.
Are there any other kind of broader challenges or pieces of the hop breeding process that you find either particularly difficult or particularly rewarding?
That's a good question.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think all crops have their challenges. I think in brewing, it's a kind of double-edged sword. You have to be super focused because even if you have something really good, to get it off the ground is really difficult. And so you kind of want to you should focus on the varieties that are special, but you also have to keep your options open because there's such diversity of what brewers are looking for. I think that's our challenge. It's like a blessing and a curse. So we want to offer variety, but it's also, it's hard to rein it. You know, I'd say it's tough to rein in where you should focus sometimes. And
it's like Wayne Gretzky. You got to skate to where the puck's gonna be, not where it is, right?
Yeah, it's interesting that along those lines. You know, I find it, even this far into my career, I find it very exciting how much we continue to learn. And so, you know, even after 25 years of doing this, we're still finding opportunities. You know, the puck's still all over the damn place, you know, and so we're still finding those opportunities to expand selection and select for different things. So it's not just as simple as, oh, this smells great, this makes great beer. We're learning more about the compounds and how they interact in beer and how we could take advantage of that. We're learning more about the genetics that are underlying that. And so with this knowledge base, we now know more than we ever did about what's driving all that, but it's also pointing out we know so little. And so I think that's what's exciting to me, is the fact that you're working with this, you know, kind of a metabolic powerhouse in terms of a plant, and there's a lot that can happen there that we still haven't tapped, I think, and that's the exciting part. So there's a whole open field in front of us in terms of really taking advantage of that and expanding on that, you know. So I think that's exciting.
I think that's an interesting point, you know, that the more you learn what you don't know yet, and opens up new avenues for even further exploration.
Right.
Well, that seems like a great place to bring this to a close. AccuBrew is an analytical tool designed to collect and compare the information brewers need to produce consistent results. Get funky with Fermentis Safe Brew BR8, the first dry Brettanomyces bruxellensis culture available to brewers. Z-Biotics is the world's first genetically engineered probiotic invented by PhD scientists to tackle rough mornings after drinking. And get 25% off all Arrived hardware when you launch with Arrived before December 1st, 2022. Also want to throw out some thanks to Yakima Valley Tourism, who has made this trip possible for us here at Craft Beer and Brewing. Go to visit Yakima.com to start planning your own trip. Highly encourage everyone who listens to this podcast and who loves beer and loves the art of brewing. You got to come out to Yakima. You've got to see it happen in person. And there's something special and a beautiful energy, especially this time of year with harvest, that everyone owes it to themselves to experience. Michael, if people want to learn more about Haas, where do they find more information about what you all are doing?
I guess our website, of course, JohnIHaas.com.
Sure. Jason, if people want to learn more about what you're doing, where do they find you guys?
Yeah, both the Yakima Chief Ranch's website, Yakima Chief Hops website. Yeah, for sure.
Cool. And Hop Breeding Corporation, do they have your own presence for that
we
too?
We do have a website as well. I guess we should mention that, hopbreedingcompany.com. Yeah.
Probably hasn't been updated in a while.
Yeah, it's probably needs an update, but...
Well, I'm excited. I know brewers are excited to see what you all come up with next, because the world of beer today wouldn't be what it is without, and it's really not overstating it to say that some of the varieties of hops that you all have produced have made this current world of craft beer what we've seen now in terms of possibility of flavor in the world of craft beer. That growth has been predicated on the existence of hops that help drive that kind of flavor. And so the growth of craft brewers has to go hand in hand with the development of these great hop varieties. You can't have one without the other. Absolutely crucial to this world of craft beer that we're in. So thank you all for the great work that you all are doing. Cheers.
Thank you.
Cheers. Appreciate it.
This podcast is brought to you by Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine, for those that love to make and drink great beer. Learn more online or subscribe at beerandbrewing.com, or find us on social media at Craft Beer Brew.